I am Sumit Gupta, and this is Choosing Leadership, a podcast for high performers with big dreams at work and life. This is a podcast for people who know deep inside that there is more. Have you achieved a great deal of success, but on the inside you still feel empty and like an imposter? Do other people see you as a strong leader? And you wonder why it still feels so lonely and suffocating? The aim of this podcast is not to provide you more content, but instead shift the context under which you operate. I dare to speak to the tremendous power which you already have rather than what you believe are your strengths and limitations. This podcast is called Choosing Leadership because that is what leadership is, a choice. And this is the Leadership Journey series. I am interviewing leaders with an interesting story to learn how they got where they are today. We all have a lot to learn from each other's stories, of where we started, where we are now, and our successes and struggles on the way. With this series of interviews, my attempt is to give leaders an opportunity to share their stories and for all of us to learn from their generous sharing. Bhav is the head of product analytics at Hopin and skilled in analytics, marketing, conversion optimization, and leadership. He is also the founder of Craft Talks, which are a place for like-minded people to get together and share ideas and thoughts on CRO, analytics, and product. In the interview, Bhav shares not just about his leadership style, but also the madman part of him. He talks about the incredible role luck plays in our journeys and how he uses drawing to bring deep focus to his work, and how that helps him stay balanced as a leader. Hi, Bhavik. Welcome to the Choosing Leadership podcast.
Thank you so much. Hi, nice to meet you. Thanks for inviting me.
Same here. Glad to have you here. And for our listeners, can you begin with sharing a little bit about who you are and what do you do?
Yeah, I'm Bhav. I'm head of product analytics for a company called Hopin. We're a virtual conferencing platform. And I basically support our product engineering teams and design teams to make data-driven decisions. My team and I do, not me specifically. And I've been doing this now for nearly 8, 9, 10 years, I think maybe. Professionally, I've been working for maybe 15 years, but I've been in this space, like product engineering, design, data, and analytics for like maybe nearly 10 years.
Can you share a little bit of your journey? What took you to where you are today? What are some of the key events or any incidents which you would like to highlight, either on the positive or on the negative side?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you ask. I think for me, I've always put a lot of my journey down to luck, like just having been at the right place at the right time with the right manager who was able to guide me into the role I am in now, and to this day I still do. If it wasn't for her, I probably wouldn't have been in the position. So I consider myself quite fortunate. I think it was nearly 8 years ago, no, maybe like 9, 10 years ago. I was working for a company called Photobox. I'd been doing performance marketing, and although my role was very much growth focused and marketing focused, a lot of my interests were around data and analytics. And I'd put myself, there was a head of acquisition role going at my company, and my manager, she was hiring for it, and I said to her, I'd love to go for this role, put myself forward. And she told me no, which was probably the best decision ever. And I didn't have the foresight to see how good a decision that was, but her rationale was like, this role was not for me. She was like, Bhav, you're not, like, you can do it, you're probably great at it, but this is not for you. And it was only when a role of head of analytics came open in the company, and then she backed me the entire way. It would have meant that I would have left her team and moved into a different team, but she supported that 100%. And in fact, she was one who put me forward saying, Bhav, this is the role you should go for. And I put myself forward, and she, like I said, she backed me the entire way. And I was given the opportunity to move into my first manager position, which was for analytics. And yeah, and I've been on that journey ever since. So I think for me, it was just having a good manager sprinkled with an incredible amount of luck that allowed me to be where I am today.
Yeah, I think we can underestimate how much impact a good manager can make.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree.
Yeah. So what did she saw in you, right, in that moment to give you that advice first and then to back you up later? And what did you realize about yourself as a result of that experience?
I think from my point of view, I was just hungry for the promotion. And I think I'd been in the role at that point for 3 years or two or 3 years. and I was ready to take that next step, but it wasn't the right step to take. And thankfully, she saw that and was able to say, actually, Bhav, this is not the role for you. But I was also fortunate that I didn't, because of course, naturally, I was disappointed, and part of me started to think maybe I should look elsewhere. But I don't know, part of me trusted her, and I stayed. And when the role came open, I was suddenly able to see actually she was absolutely right, because the head of analytics role over the head of acquisition role was definitely for me. I have a much deeper interest in data analysis and experimentation than I do in growth marketing. So I think growth marketing I naturally gravitated towards it because it's a very numeric based discipline, but my interests lie in doing data analysis and solving problems. And the analytics role was much better suited to not just my skill sets, but actually also where I get my energy. And thankfully, again, she could see that in my day-to-day work.
Yeah, and what you're pointing out is that at that moment, even she could see that when you were not able to, or when you were attracted by something else.
Exactly, and I'm grateful. If it wasn't for her intuition, her skills as a manager, someone else may have put me forward for it, or someone else may not put me forward for it, who knows? But thankfully, she was an exceptional leader. And I think a lot of my leadership style stems from her. Of course, I've learned from different managers over the years, both good and bad. But I think my first experience of good leadership comes from Lee, and she was very much an empathy-led manager. So it's my first experience around what good management looks like.
And how does that shape like your own decision making now, but then also how you lead others, how you motivate others?
I think over time, I think when I first started, I potentially swung the pendulum too far one way, and I think I failed to see where Lee was really good, which was she wasn't just an empathy-led person, but she was very much a business-focused person. But I always saw like this empathetical side of her because she was my direct manager, and I missed her skills in a wider setting with other stakeholders and other people. And I think I tried early on, at least very early on, to be a bit too people first. And sometimes you have to, as a manager, you have to strike a balance between empathy, company performance, things like that. So I would say for me, it's certainly been a journey, and I've been influenced. I can say like my next big influence was another CFO when I was working for a company called Moo, who taught me about what exceptional leadership, not just the people aspect of it, but actually also things like strategic thinking, empathy for stakeholders, not just for your own team, putting yourselves in the shoes of company performance and trying to understand all of the bigger picture, not just limit it to like my own team. I think it's easy for managers to want to be really good managers by being their team's best friend. And I certainly struggled with that. But actually, it's only when you strike that balance between being a good manager for your team, but also being a good leader in your organization. And I wouldn't say I've mastered it by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm certainly very mindful of it and try to think about decisions I make that impact the company, that impact the team, just, like the bigger picture as opposed to always just focusing on the team.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing towards is that every team is there for a reason. And it's so easy sometimes for managers to just focus on their team or the members in the team and forget that what are the stakeholders or who are the people that the team is actually there to serve. And then are those interests, are those concerns being taken care of? And I think that's what you were referring to when you talked about external shareholders, external stakeholders, as well as internal people in the team.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it was one of those situations where I think, so now I'm referring to Ed, who was our CFO. I was reporting to him for a while, and he was able to help me things like, hey, Bhav, take a step back, put yourselves in the shoes of your stakeholders. And it sounds really obvious now. I know it sounds really dumb actually to be able to say it, but it had to be pointed out that maybe some of these things will come intuitively to other people, and everyone learns differently. But for me, it was really around like, Bhav, you don't need to be the smartest person in the room every time. Allow people to come on the journey with you, take them with you. You don't have to be that guy in that room. So, and it was only when I realized actually after that moment, I started observing how he was in wider meetings with our CEO, with our marketing directors, with everyone. And he was very diplomatic. And whilst he's still a people person, which is strange for a CFO, but he was very much a people person. He brought this incredible sort of wisdom to whatever situation he was in. And he was able to adapt each time and always be very diplomatic, but firm in the roles. He wouldn't like just roll over and take whatever someone else had to say, but he always listened. And I think it was that kind of thinking that kind of taking a step back, that mindset around, hey, look, let's remember we work with people who have different challenges, and try to empathize with them as well as their team and your own problems.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So you talked earlier about, right, figuring out what gave you energy. Can you share a little bit more about that? Like what all gives you energy in your work?
Yeah, I think energy is an interesting thing. There, certainly nowadays, when I took that first role as in that leadership, that management position, the concept of an individual contributor didn't exist.
Mm.
It's only really now we see this rise of individual contributors and people are able to progress in the company without having to progress into management positions. And I talk about this with my team constantly, where it's when we have career development conversations, I generally ask them what gives you energy? What is it that gets you up? What do you enjoy? And for some of them, it's problem solving, and they don't like the monotony of sitting in meetings and playing this devil's advocate and being this diplomat. They like solving problems. And for those people, an individual contributor track is probably better suited to their own personal career progression. For someone like myself, where I feel like I didn't have the option, when I think about what gives me energy now, is actually not, so energy is like a balance. There's going to be things that give you energy and things that drain you of energy. As long as the scales for me are tipped in the right way and I get more energy than the energy I'm drained from, for me, it means that I'm in the right role. And the things that give me energy are things like developing a team, building a team, helping, being a soundboard for them to solve their, like when they have challenges or they meet roadblocks, being able to pick them apart, just Lee and like Ed and all of the great managers in the past have done for me, to be that person, to be able to help them see past their own barriers and look beyond like their own challenges or roadblocks and help overcome them. So for me, I get a lot more energy from that than I lose energy from sitting. Of course, no one likes sitting in meetings. No one likes doing strategic planning, and that's not too bad. But you don't want to spend all day in those type of situations. So as long as I've got that balance and I'm able to build and develop teams and people and help them on their own career path, I feel like that's the surplus of energy I get from doing that exceeds the amount of energy I lose from having to be in sort of like these dull situations where no one really likes to be in.
Yeah. So you have this very interesting mix of being data driven, being in a very analytical background, but now you said that you get your energy from like a lot of people related or getting a team together, getting them working. So is there anything in when you were younger, is there anything which is pulling you towards this direction or this mix or this paradox of data as well as empathy?
I think, I don't know about when I was younger, but a large part of sort of like my early influence has always been maths, science, and believe it or not, art. So I feel like maths, between those three subjects, you get to see the world with different lenses. So from the maths and science perspective, you get to see the world from a very quantitative, matter of fact point of view. And then from art, you have this very abstract interpretation of what things mean and how people interpret them, and everyone's different and people react to situations very differently. So I don't know if that's what shaped me, but it's like that balance of, okay, I still get to work in this quantitative space, but as a manager, I also get to work in situations which aren't black and white and very much require interpretation. And I've given bad advice because of bad interpretation of a situation. I remember my very first bad piece of advice I gave as a manager. It was horrible. And to this day, I cringe at the fact that I gave this terrible advice, but I misinterpreted the situation and I needed to go through that to be able to grow as a manager.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned these three elements, right? Apart from leading a team, do you do anything else which is artistic, or does art play any other role in your life today?
Yeah, not in my professional life, but in my personal life, I have a Instagram account which is full of sort of like my own personal artwork that I do. So I like to paint and draw when I'm not working. Obviously, I've got two kids, which means that my free time is limited and precious. Mm-hmm. But if I get some time between work, kids, the occasional Netflix binge, like sitting down and painting or drawing helps me take my mind off things and just focus on being in the moment. So I feel like that helps. And there are elements of it which I try to bring in like my workspace and like deep focus. I'm one of those people that I won't focus regularly, But when I focus, I'll put myself into almost a meditative state where it's nothing but the problem I'm working on. Yeah, I guess going back to your question, managing people is great. Professionally, of course, a large part of my role entails about looking at the future, trying to understand where are some of the challenges. I think, again, it's a skill I've had to develop. I would have said historically, sort of like my foresight and my ability to see into the future was always limited to sort of like the next 3 to 6 months. And you need that, of course, so you can't constantly be looking 2 years out. But the ability to develop that 1 year, 2 year out view wasn't something that came intuitively, and it had to be pointed out, like, hey, Bhav, take a step back. You're too close to the problem. You need to take a more, like a 10,000 foot view of the world. So now, from like, I'll split my week between being really close to the problems and like what my team are working on, but also then taking a huge step back, saying, actually, are we as a team heading in the right direction?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that about like the painting and the drawing. And this is very personal to me as well, because I'm also a photographer, apart from like having a background in technology. And what I do today, which is basically coaching leaders, I draw a lot of lessons, exactly like you shared, from my photography. So photography is a meditative practice for me, but then I also take a lot from that. So thank you for sharing that side of yourself and how that builds into your adding perspective to your work and allowing you to have that deep focus at work as well.
Yeah, I think it's easy to get distracted in this day and age, and I have to make a conscious effort to really focus when I'm, especially with work tasks, but sometimes it's just so dull. I know I can get in the zone, but I have to remove myself of like many distractions to be able to get in there. But once I'm in there, I can crack out a good 4, 5, 6 hours of focused work, which helps. Yeah, that might only be like once or twice a week, but I think for me that's plenty to get through some of the big things.
Yeah, yeah. When I talk to a lot of people outside the management or the leadership space, sometimes I see that they have a very limited view of people in management. They are too planned or too structured, and they have no space for flexibility. And I want to explore, given what you have shared so far, is there something which people misunderstand about you, which you see that people don't get it, at least in the first?
Yeah, I guess it depends on like, and again, I talk to my team about this a lot. It comes down to communication style. Everyone has their own preferred. Most people can flex multiple different styles, but usually people have a dominant communication style. It's either overly analytical, it's either overly aggressively, like not aggressive, but like direct, or it's overly empathetic, or it's overly casual. And I think misinterpretation happens when you're talking to someone who has a conflicting communication style to you. So if I give you an example, if you're an analyst like myself, it's easy to go into complex data mathematical problems with someone who is the diagonal opposite to me, who might have a more of a more outgoing style, a bit more fun, casual. They don't need the details, they just need the problems. And I think sometimes that level of misinterpretation happens when you've potentially gone too deep into the problem, or you haven't gone deep enough, depending on your communication style. So again, it's something I talk to my team about a lot, is recognizing this in your stakeholders and people you're speaking to. If you don't want to be misinterpreted, or you don't want, you want us to get to some outcome, you have to recognize who you're speaking to and adopt and adapt the way you see their style. Again, you don't have to be directly like them, but certainly recognizing what resonates with them when you're talking to them, and honing in on that and communicating that way. So I don't know. I think, of course, there's many reasons why people might misinterpret things, but I feel like a lot of it comes down to communication. And if you adapt the right style for your audience, you at least minimize the risk of something being lost in translation. And then, of course, there might be disagreements and different points of views and things like that. But generally, if you can solve the communication element, you give yourself a fighting chance to not be misinterpreted.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. What I'm also getting present to is this requires a level of awareness to, first of all, not just be aware of your own style, but also to be aware of what somebody else's style might be. And then also the larger context of this conversation, right? What are we trying to solve? And it's so easy to sometimes get lost into the tactical or the, as you said, right, the mathematical or scientific side of what you are arguing about. So how do you build that awareness, and how do you help others build that awareness as well, without getting caught up in the details?
So I haven't solved this at a global scale. I think the reason I have a certain level of awareness around this is because I've had someone directly give me feedback saying, "Hey, Bav, you have a tendency to go too deep into the problem, or you waffle a little bit and you talk yourself out of the solution you've arrived at. You've arrived at the outcome you want to. Just stop talking." And I think it was that brutal feedback. And I love not criticism, but like constructive feedback. I think constructive feedback is very healthy, and you have to be someone who is open to it and willing to take it. And for me, it was being able to receive that feedback. Initially, I didn't take it well, but I stopped. I reflected on the feedback that was shared with me, and I thought, okay, you know what, I'm going to change. And certainly with my team, whenever I find myself in situations where it will usually be instantaneous. So if we've been in a situation where someone in my team is presenting to someone, or we're talking in a more discussion arena where ideas are being flown around. Generally, what I'll do is I'll afterwards speak to someone in my team, say, "Hey, look, this was a great discussion. What you brought to the table was fantastic. There were times when you potentially weren't able to deliver the point because of X, Y, and Z, and usually it comes down to the fact that you didn't recognize who was in the room with you." We talk about leadership, and I hate the fact that this is true, but majority of leaders have a red leadership style, which is direct, like straight to the point. And it's not because they're red people, maybe they are, but generally it's because they're absorbing so much information. They don't have time for excess, and they don't have time for the detail. They just want to know what it is they need to know. It's really like pointing that out to my team. Hey, look, you're in a conversation with our COO. That conversation should be very different to the conversation you have with your product manager, where it's very much a two-way communication. Whereas with a COO, it's going to be a one-way communication. Like you share what you need to, ask if there's any questions, and take a step back and say, okay, cool, and then exit the conversation. So I think when we talk about people being aware of this, again, I was fortunate someone felt comfortable to give me that feedback. I try and give that feedback to my team, but at a more global scale, I think there is this distinct lack of training in all organizations, even in education, which prepares people for these non-technical skills that are so critical as you progress into leadership positions. You don't have to be a leader to know when how to effectively communicate with someone, but there just isn't that development available for people. And I think this is one of the reasons why you get silos in organizations. You get people who are frustrated because they feel like they're not being heard, is because they just, in some instances, just don't have the right level of awareness or training that says this is the best way to communicate. And it's not just spoken communication, written communication, like verbal communication, non-verbal communication. We communicate in so many different ways that people sometimes forget.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something very relevant here, not just in the context of workplaces, but also in the context of education as a whole, because it's not just about thinking or planning or even digesting new information. It's also a lot about connecting with people, empathizing, building relationship, and that happens at a very different level of. It's still a very human thing, but it happens at a level which we never learn in the classroom, which we never learn in a textbook.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those learned through experience type lessons. It's not something you can get out of. Some people who want to focus on their communication styles, you can go and find literature that exists out there, but it's not baked into everyday education. And it's a real shame, actually, because communicating with people is so important, especially in this day and age where you're likely to offend someone, you're likely to misinterpret someone, you're likely to, not be able to have a real constructive conversation just because you're unable to communicate or empathize with someone. So yeah, it's a real shame.
Yeah. So given what you have shared today, right? So understanding what gives you energy, what brings you meaning, but also realizing that this is a road less traveled, or there is a lot of uncertainties in this road. So how do you see a future which is purposeful as well as successful for you? What's ahead for you?
Great question. I don't know, if I'm completely honest. Right now, my challenges are predominantly focused on the problem space that we're working in. We're coming out of inverted commas, coming out of a pandemic and returning to a world which is having a huge influence on the performance of our company. And we're a startup still. I only recently celebrated our 3-year anniversary. The problems right now are very much company-faced problems. And I'd like to think once we come out of this economic downturn that we're facing right now and revisit some of the more human elements of working in a company, we can start having some of those meaningful conversations. I do have a platform which I can share on. So I run a meetup community, which is nearly 3,500 people, made up of product analysts, product managers, data scientists, et cetera. And we've run events which haven't always been focused on the discipline itself, but also some of the softer elements of the workplace environment. So, and I generally tend to write about this stuff as well. So if you've seen some of my blog posts, they're not always focused on the technical elements of my job. They're focused on some of the more like foundational skills that we would expect to have as humans. So I don't know. It's a good question. I couldn't tell you. If I'm being completely honest, I don't know what the answer is, what the future holds.
Yeah. I think you said you're a 3-year-old company, and then out of those last 2 years have been the most turbulent for most companies. And just as we are like getting out of the pandemic, there is this huge downturn or recession in that, especially in the tech industry, which who knows what it will bring in the next 6 months to 1 year. So it's also very human, right? These challenges, what we have seen is very human, and there is no recipe. There is like no manual for dealing with these kind of challenges, which we have never seen before.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think the important thing is we'll go through these cycles where company performance goes up, it goes down. As long as people remember to have really constructive conversations, that's the important thing. And taking that step back, reminding people not to go so deep into the intricacies of a small problem that we forget to look at the entire picture. I use the expression, we're so focused on the gravestone, we forget the graveyard. It's only relevant now because everything feels like it's like dying from an economic perspective, it's just going in the wrong direction. But, like focusing on the gravestone by itself, that sometimes we'll overlook the entire graveyard.
Yes, exactly. And I think also about conversations, what you shared, right, is because that's where leadership happens. Many times we can talk about leadership in abstract concept like trust or empathy, but the whole thing doesn't matter if you cannot be empathetic in this conversation that you're having or the next conversation that you're planning to have. So conversation is like where the rubber meets the road, especially for leaders. And that's their biggest tool, or that's their biggest leverage point to either shift something in themselves or with their teams on a larger scale.
Yeah, and actually, you know what? You make a great point, actually. It's easy to be a good leader when things are looking great. It's only when, you're staring down the barrel of a gun and you have to make like big decisions and you have to prioritize ruthlessly and you're going to disappoint people, that actually your skills as a leader and your authenticity and your quality of communications, they really start to show themselves and your true character is revealed. And I think it'll be interesting because I think in this tech space, we're hearing about so many companies who are letting people go, which of course they have to if they want to sustain growth. But the nature in which, so you hear some horror stories about how people have been informed that they're being let go, just goes to show you actually leadership it's not easy, and people can do it right, or at least the perception of doing it right when things are great. But it's only when things are like there's turbulence that you really get to see what good leadership looks like. I hope I'm doing the right things. You never really know, but I've seen some real horror stories out there.
Yeah, I know what you might be referring to, and I think a recession is sometimes can be a good way to filter out bad practices, bad companies, ineffective leaders. But again, not from a point of something being wrong in those people, but also as a learning opportunity, because a good economics basically suppresses a lot of signals. And what we see is a lot of good signals if we can listen to it powerfully without being depressed or without letting it demotivate us. Those are good signals for every leader, irrespective of whether their situation is turning out like according to the market or not. Yeah. So just to begin to wrap it up, what is it right now that you are most grateful for, given your journey as a leader, as a professional?
I think I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I think people often forget that, yes, of course, you've earned your right to be in a position of leadership, but there's an incredible amount of luck for every person who makes it into a management position, there's probably like 10x who don't. And I think the people who are fortunate enough to be promoted need to recognize that actually they're not being promoted. Yes, of course, they're being promoted for what they've achieved, but what made them successful when they were individual contributors isn't what's going to make them successful when they're managers. And I think it took me a while to recognize that I can't solve every problem. I'm not supposed to be like my team's best friend. I'm supposed to be their advocate. I'm supposed to have the hard conversations when I need to. I need to motivate them when I need to. I need to praise them when I need to. And recognizing that all of the skills that got me into this position are not going to be the skills that will make me successful moving forward. So I think for me, I'm grateful to be able to recognize that and continuously have the opportunity to develop it. I also feel like certainly moving into certainly a first-time leadership position, it's difficult. And I say this all the time, but middle management is the loneliest place on earth. You're stuck between senior leadership and your team, and you don't get the skills and the support from your company to develop these skills as a leader, as a manager. And you're put in this sink or swim situation, and you're expected to swim, and it's easy to sink. So I think having a network of peers, people who are at the same level as you, don't have to be in your discipline. Talking to them, understanding what the challenges are, reaching out to people, understanding what you need to develop as a manager sooner is going to be super helpful. And I'm grateful that I have a good network and I'm able to speak to people, and I've been able to learn from incredibly talented people, and also fortunate to have learned from really bad managers about what it takes to be a good leader. And I continue to try and bring that into my day-to-day and try and keep learning.
Thank you for sharing that. What I love the most is how vast you covered that question from, and also how you have a sense of humor about, right? It's not an easy ride, but at the same time, you learn from your mistakes, you learn from your bad managers as well, and then you keep a sense of humor about that, which in the end makes the whole journey more enjoyable or makes it lighter. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for this conversation. It's been super useful, super interesting.
Yeah. So where can anybody find out about you? Anybody who is listening, if they want to reach out?
So you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at DodoNerd, DONERD, or I'm quite active on LinkedIn. It's usually more professional stuff on LinkedIn, whereas Twitter is the ramblings of a madman. Or you can just drop me a message or something like that via any one of the social media channels I've just mentioned. Yeah, and that's it. I don't really have a plug, sorry.
No worries, Bhav. Thank you for sharing your side as a leader, as a professional, but also the madman side of it. And I think because that's what makes us human beings, and that, as you said, that is included in leadership. Leadership does not exclude anything which is a part of being human. And thank you for showing us the full side of yourself. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. No, you're welcome. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. That's it for this episode of Choosing Leadership with Sumit Gupta. I choose leadership every time I record this podcast, and I invite you to do the same. I invite you to design a life of joy, meaning, pride, and satisfaction, not just for yourself, but also for those around you. This is what I do most naturally, to lovingly and gently provoke you, to help you see your own light, to help you see what you are already capable of. I say what might be uncomfortable for me to say or for you to hear, to show you that all our dreams which have been on hold are within our grasp. If you like the sound of it, do not forget to leave a rating. I invite you to subscribe to my newsletter at deployyourself.com/newsletter. You can also reach out on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook to share any other comment or feedback. I want to thank everyone who contributed to making this show a reality. And thank you for listening. Always remember that you are enough, you are loved, and you matter. This is Sumit. Until next time, keep choosing leadership.